hearty welcome to Johannan from Johannes Lehnemann in Germany.
Hello, Sherto.
Yes.
Hannah, nice to see you. I was looking forward to this.
I was looking forward to good to see you as well. It's been great back to be in contact.
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
I've been passing your wonderful book around even before it's published.
Thank you.
Hello, Johannes.
Good morning from York.
Put this on gallery first. I see that Liam has also joined us. I don't know if he's hearing at this point.
Good morning. Well, it's good morning from where I am. Not quite. Hi.
I'm
Hanan,
here. Hanan, nice to see you, Hanan.
Nice to see you too.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Eleonora. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, good.
Good morning to you, Liam from Johannes in Germany.
Johannes, good to see you.
It's good to see all of you. My name is
my
name is Esther Aslan, and I'll be moderating the next 4 contributions.
Esther, well, good luck with your task, Esther.
Oh, thank you. We will get through this. How are you, Liam?
Yeah, I'm very good actually. I'm a bit busy, but isn't everybody? Yeah.
So Liam, you are. So if we were going to start with Hanan, is the first contribution, and Liam, you will be at 9:20.
Great.
And Eleonora is at 9:40. You're joining us from Switzerland, so it's 10:40 for you. And then Skerto, is it Skerto? Sherto?
Hello, good morning, everybody. Hello.
Sherto, hi.
Yeah.
Do I pronounce that correctly?
That's right. Yeah, Sherto.
Sherto.
Right. Yeah.
And we'll have you at 10 o'clock.
Mhm.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. Hanan, if I'm going to start introducing you, and I'll pass over to you very shortly after.
Okay.
Are we? Yes. Hanan. Hanan Alexander is joining us from the University of Haifa today, and he's the Dean of Faculty of Education and Professor of Philosophy of Education, and he chairs the Executive Board of the Center for Jewish Education. His contribution today is titled Reclaiming the Public Sphere, Peaceful Coexistence Through Pedagogies of the Sacred, of Difference and of Hope. And Hanan, if I make you a host and pass
Yeah,
over
I don't have a PowerPoint, so you don't have to make it.
Brilliant. Over to you, Hanan.
Yeah.
Look forward to it.
One small correction. I am very happily the former Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Haifa. I finished my term just this month. So I am.
Congratulations.
I begin my life as a free man. It was a wonderful opportunity and a great opportunity to lead really a fabulous faculty. And now I return just to be a member of that fabulous faculty. So other than that, all the other stuff I still do. So I'm going to read a paper, and I think it'll probably just be easiest to read a paper. I understand that we're going to usually when Ednan asks us to participate in the conference, the book that follows. So I figured there was something that needed to be written. So here it goes. One of the great accomplishments of modernity has been the establishment of societies in which people can live together with others whose ways of life are different than their own. Unfortunately, this achievement is currently threatened by rising forms of populism on the right and the left of the political and religious spectrums that are challenging the idea that peaceful coexistence across deep difference is a valuable social ideal. A growing chasm exists in the public deliberations of democracies around the world today, in which people of diverse religious and spiritual persuasions find it increasingly difficult to communicate across difference in order to live together in a common civil society. These differences are often tied to political, ideological, ethical orientations, moral proclivities, cultural identities, nationality, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and more. Consequently, extreme positions on the right and the left of the political and religious spectrums have come increasingly to dominate the public square, which challenges peaceful coexistence across difference. In this talk, I argue that the time has come to take the public square back from these extremes in diverse democratic societies by offering an alternative account of how we might live together in peaceful coexistence and a concomitant pedagogy to prepare youngsters to do so. After a brief review of the role of diversity in pre-modern social and political theory, I turned to the two revolutions of modernity that laid the foundation for contemporary thinking on the topic, and I argued that the most influential trends in education for religious and spiritual affiliation that emerged from these modern revolutions have contributed to this chasm. One follows the political liberalism and educational thought of American philosophers John Rawls and John Dewey, and the other cosmopolitan multiculturalism of German critical theorist Jürgen Habermas and of the Brazilian critical pedagogue Paulo Freire. I then consider an alternative to these accounts of the public square, which requires a recovery of what I call humanism, grounded in the diversity liberalism of Isaiah Berlin and the diversity theology of Jonathan Sachs and Emmanuel Levinas. The essay concludes with reference to some educational consequences of this analysis and draws on my own contribution to educational philosophy called Pedagogy of the Sacred and Pedagogy of Difference. During pre-modern times, Western politics was dominated by ancient Greek philosophy, according to which a virtuous society should serve a uniform vision of the good life. Plato proposed a hierarchical version of such a society, according to which each would receive resources and power according to his or her own perceived capacity to engage in a form of dialectical reasoning that would liberate from false beliefs and lead to a proper understanding of the idea of justice. Such a society should be governed by philosophers, not monarchs, oligarchs, or democratic citizens, who are capable of comprehending this idea and of implementing it in practice. By way of contrast, his pupil Aristotle thought that a virtuous society should serve its citizens, not the idea of justice, by enabling them to flourish. Although human flourishing may be fostered in different ways by distinct political communities that embody diverse cultural traditions, to do so, these communities must bring the underlying rationality of reality itself. Aristotle referred to this underlying rationality as God, who brought the university into being and whose comprehension and contemplation constitute the ultimate purpose of human existence. Within medieval scholastic philosophy, this proto-pluralistic outlook enabled the possibility of conversation across different communities, each organized around its respective religious tradition, provided that each tradition sought reconciliation between faith, as revealed in its sacred texts, and human reason, as conceived by pagan philosophy. To live in such a community, however, required adherence to a uniform account of what one should believe and how one should behave that was determined heteronomously by local religious and political authorities, not autonomously by the individual. This all changed with the two revolutions of modernity, Enlightenment and Emancipation. The Enlightenment was a 16th and 17th century intellectual movement that challenged transcendental assumptions of Platonic and Aristotelian rationalism by subjecting them to a rigorous form of empirical skepticism. This sort of skepticism tested all beliefs against an account of objective reality outside of human consciousness, uncomfortable with Plato's world of ideas and essences and Aristotle's teleology that begins and ends with the original cause. For example, in a doctrine known as empiricism, 16th century British philosopher John Locke maintained that people are not born with innate ideas, but that knowledge is determined by experience alone, derived from sense perception. In a state of nature, therefore, prior to experiencing the world, people are fundamentally equal and should be entitled to restrict one another's life, liberty, and property only following a mutually agreed upon social contract. With 17th century Scottish philosopher David Hume subjected the assumptions of this kind of skepticism to the same sort of doubts that empiricism used to challenge pre-modern rationalism. 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant responded. He proposed that understanding is only possible because of certain rational capacities with which human beings are endowed prior to ever experiencing the world, and that a just society should be governed by the equal and autonomous exercise of these very rational capacities by its citizens, not by higher authorities. These Enlightenment ideas gave rise to a series of political revolutions in the 18th and 19th century, known collectively as emancipation. They were mostly grounded in a liberal democratic account of justice that followed the political theories of Locke and Kant. According to this account, the right of autonomous citizens to choose ways of life for themselves, based on their own rational capacities, should take precedence over any conception of the good life that may be promoted by one group or another, whether based on religious faith, political ideology, ethical tradition, ethnic affiliation, or some other amalgamation of heteronymous ideals, attitudes, and customs. In this view, it is the obligation of any moral form of government to protect this fundamental right to choose a way of life. This value became known as liberal toleration, or in a word, pluralism. And it has been subjected to two sorts of criticism, one pertaining to Locke and the other to Kant. The difficulties with Locke's position is that an actual social contract would only commit those who gave their assent to the agreement in real time. You can only agree to a contract if you sign it. This is where an implied contract was thought to be relevant. One's consent to the original agreement could be inferred, it was thought, from one's willingness to enjoy the benefits that accrue from living in a society so founded. But this, of course, does not follow. The fact that one resides in a society and benefits from its organization does not imply that one would agree to the terms and conditions contained in its founding documents. Hence, the fact that one assents to them may be less voluntary than Locke supposed. The difficulty with Kant's position was noted by the 19th century German counter-enlightenment philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Contrary to Kant, Hegel held that reason is not the a priori lens through which people interpret the real world outside of consciousness. Rather, reason is acquired throughout history by way of a posteriori experience itself within the world outside of consciousness. Reason progresses, according to this view, by means of a dialectical process inspired by Plato, but inserted into history by Hegel. Each generation criticized the ideas of its immediate predecessors to liberate those ideas and their proponents from error until absolute freedom is achieved, first by a single nation or culture, and eventually by all of humanity. Protecting the right of autonomous individuals to choose their way of life by placing political authority in their hands may prove to be highly problematic, therefore. These individuals may not share a common account of reason, or their respective ways of reasonings may turn out to be flawed from one viewpoint or another. Extreme interpretations of this Hegelian view on both the right and the left of the political spectrum may well provide the basis for much of the populism that is challenging pluralism today. But this claim alone does not address the conceptual difficulty that arises from Hegel's critique of Kant. Rawls and Habermas are perhaps the most influential recent philosophers of diversity to address these difficulties with the liberal politics of Locke and Kant. However, the responses of Rawls and Habermas to Locke and Kant have also proven to be problematic. This is one of the main reasons, I contend, why the great pluralistic achievement of modernity is currently under assault. Rawls responded to difficulties with Locke's social contract by way of an agreement that would be accepted under certain hypothetical conditions. This is an ingenious idea. He called this the veil of ignorance. According to this idea, people would agree to two principles of justice were they to be aware of the proposition of, were they to be unaware of the position they would hold in a society governed by them. The first of these is procedural justice. This principle would guarantee that the rules and institutions of society would be so constructed as to be administered fairly, without reference to irrelevant social, economic, gendered, ethnic, racial, or other considerations. The second of these is distributive justice. It would ensure that all things being equal, resources would be allocated so as to protect the interest of the weakest elements of society. However, when Walls came to realize that these two principles can themselves be conceived as a comprehensive conception of the good, he proposed a more limited theory, what he called political liberalism. According to this alternative, accepting certain burdens of judgment would lead citizens to seek principles of justice compatible with every reasonable person's conception of the good. He called this public reason, which constitutes the basis of an overlapping consensus to direct the legitimate exercise of political power. Habermas, on the other hand, sought to revive a version of Kantian rationality by reconsidering certain left-leaning interpretations of Hegel. In contrast to Hegel's view that history progresses by way of dialectical conversation across the generations, Karl Marx held that the true engine of human progress entails overcoming current conflicts between those who possess economic resources and the means to produce them, and those who do not. Procedural justice cannot be guaranteed in this view unless economic resources are distributed equitably. Otherwise, those with more money, with greater capacity to make money, will always be able to exercise undue influence on the exercise of rules and regulations. To this claim, neo-Marxists such as Horkheimer and Adorno added that the pursuit of social progress must also be concerned with the non-discriminatory discourse, akin to Kantian rationality, only this time grounded in intersubjective agreement rather than in a priori conditions of individual cognition. The difficulty with Rawls' position lies in requiring citizens to embrace a particular understanding of pluralism, according to which people would be permitted to participate in public deliberation only by stating their belief in terms that could be acceptable to all. But this violates the boundaries of pluralism itself. Many beliefs, especially those associated with religious faith, cannot be formulated in terms of the sort of reasonableness without losing some of their very essence. To condition participation in civil discourse on embracing this formulation of reason, public reason, could well require leaving one's most cherished beliefs at the door. One of the reasons why the current candidate from the Republican Party in the United States for the Supreme Court is so controversial, because she brings to the table, whether one agrees with that view or not that agrees with her view, a religious interpretation of questions such as abortion that have to do with the famous decision of Roe versus Wade. The difficulty with Habermas's view lies in his assumption that a free intersubjective consensus is possible, which considers the total equalization of power to be a worthwhile end. But this may not be so. Those who do not believe in unqualified equality would inevitably be excluded from such a consensus and thus denied access to power. If people of this kind agree to such a consensus, in all likelihood, they would only do so perfunctorily because they would not want to be left without resources. Admission to the public domain in this view is predicated on accepting what some would consider to be a rather extreme account of distributive justice, whether or not one would otherwise want to do so. And this undermines diversity no less than Rawls' account of public reason. Perhaps the most influential educational theories associated with the American liberalism and the cosmopolitan multiculturalism can be found in the writings of John Dewey and Paulo Freire. Dewey argued that democratic education should prepare anonymous youngsters to solve problems encountered in experience by drawing on concepts and skills contained in the cultural heritage passed on from previous generations, if selected by their teachers. Freire, on the other hand, suggested what he called a critical pedagogy that poses problems to be addressed by groups of students who are encountered to call upon their particular backgrounds to contribute to a collective consensus. Although each of these educational theories offers a hope of individual and collective liberation from the bonds of past and current limitations, each restricts the possibility of such hope by homogenizing the many sorts of differences that need to be acknowledged, accepted, and engaged in order to achieve the sort of peaceful coexistence that could lend meaning to such aspirations. The societies generated by these political and educational theories condition equitable treatment on leaving differences at the door of the public domain. Hence, Many religious, cultural, and political worldviews often feel excluded from the public square in societies influenced by these views because they are thought to be too divisive, distinctive, or dominating. I would suggest that this is one of the reasons for the rise of the various forms of political polarization and populism across the world today, on both the right and on the left, which has to do with the pushback against these versions of liberalism, both political and multicultural, by those who feel as though their voices have been excluded from the public square, which turns out to be less tolerant of diversity than they presuppose. Rather than promoting universal toleration of difference, this sort of exclusivism has tended to isolate intolerant and hateful voices on the fringes of diverse societies, with few opportunities for tempering dialogue with alternative or opposing views that can moderate extremes. When these voices do finally make their way into the public domain, they can sometimes be especially harsh and discordant, even violent. This is to explain, not justify, these sorts of bigotries and prejudices, at least in part, and to suggest the need for an alternative political theory on which to ground the celebration of diversity and accompanying pedagogies to prepare youngsters to live in a society envisaged by such a theory. A way out of the morass generated by the growing chasm among diverse religious, spiritual, cultural, and political views can be found in a renewed commitment to our common humanity, conceived in terms of the uniqueness, not conformity, of each individual person. I have called this a recovery of humanism, and grounded my own commitment to such a recovery in the value pluralism of 20th century British philosopher Isaiah Berlin, and in the theology of difference of the Hebrew Bible as read by Jewish philosophers Jonathan Sacks and Emmanuel Levinas. Berlin viewed human existence as comprised of multiple, distinct, and often incommensurable cultures and traditions, and the task of politics to discover a modus vivendi for peaceful coexistence across difference through dialogue. This political theory has sometimes been called diversity liberalism, as opposed to political or multiculturalism. According to Sacks, the distinctiveness of each person's experience of the world follows from the idea that people are created in the image of the divine. This means that each person is different, not the same, special, singular, in a word, holy, like God, the ultimate model of holiness. These unique persons call out to us, following Levinas, in all of their individuality, and each is obliged to respond by receiving the other in a non-reciprocal relation of responsibility with the words of the Hebrew prophets, Hineni, here I am, ready to serve. In contrast to Dewey and Ferrari, I have argued that the genuine hope for peaceful coexistence is to be sought in three educational consequences of this kind of diversity advocated by Berlin, Sacks, and Levinas. I call them pedagogy of the sacred, intelligent spirituality, and pedagogy of difference. Pedagogy of the sacred, yeah?
If I can give you 2 more minutes because of 20 minutes.
I'll finish in 2 minutes, no problem. Pedagogy of the sacred entails initiation into a particular tradition or worldview to become an insider, so to say. But not just any perspective will suffice for living together in a diverse society. The particular way of life into which people should be initiated for this purpose must be prepared to dialogue alternative, even opposing orientations. I've called viewpoints that are prepared to engage alternatives in this way intelligent spiritualities. Engaging alternatives involves teaching and learning about or from them as an outsider, as it were, by way of phenomenology, sociology, history, politics, philosophy, theology, or some other relevant academic discipline, or to consider insights that they may have to offer to non-believers. Pedagogy of the sacred is concerned with initiation into a worldview that can come from that can form the basis of one's primary identity, while at the same time imparting the values and capacities needed to engage alternative perspectives in dialogue. However, how is it possible to challenge sacred perspectives of this kind, which are grounded in particular traditions, given that there is no objective or intersubjective view upon which to base this sort of inquiry? This is where pedagogy of the different comes into play, which involves instruction from or about worldviews other than one's own. It presupposes that an education worthy of the name must not only initiate into a concept of the sacred according to one tradition or another, but also offer exposure to alternative perspectives. One point of such engagement is this One point of such engagement is the same in both faith-based and common schools. The one serving a singular religious community, the other a community of the communities that encompasses multiple approaches, belief and unbelief. It is to empower students with an inquisitive attitude toward the worldviews to which they are heir or with which they choose to affiliate, and to promote respect for perspectives deeply different than their own. Taking back the public square requires the recovery of humanism and the grounded in fundamental diversity, not uniformity of human experience, and a concomitant innovative pedagogy that prepares students to embrace the ways in which they are different from others and to engage and respect the ways others may be different from them. Teaching this concept of humanity requires cultivating a robust sense of self, rooted in a tradition that is at once capable of inspiring such a sense of obligation toward others, yet also able to engage others whose sources of inspiration and obligation may be different from one's own. Herein lies the possibility of genuine hope for recovery from our current morass.
Anna, thank you for your contribution. May I remind participants that they can post their questions in the chat box as we go along, and we'll pick up on them when we reach the panel discussion at the end. Hanan, thank you. Our next speaker is Liam Guerin, who's joining us from Oxford University today. Liam is an associate professor in religious education in the Department of Education and a senior research fellow at Harris Manchester College. Liam's contribution is titled The Eve of Destruction, Peace Education and Security Studies, Origins, Ends, and Apocalypse. Liam, would you like me to make you a co-host?
Yes, please.
So you
Yes,
can share
thank
a
you very
screen?
much, Esther.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Let's do that. Yep, have you got your screen? Hold on a minute. There you go. No, that's me. Sorry. The University of Vienna, could you help me with this one and help us share Liam's screen?
See if this comes on, Esther. Does this come on?
No, let's just have a look. If I go, here we go.
You can stop. You can stop. He now is Liam. Yes.
Here we go, Liam.
Okay.
We've got
Okay,
you now.
Good. Okay, can I start now?
Please, Liam, go for it.
Okay, I'll put my timer on.
I shall remind you towards the end.
Thank you, Hanan. I think the philosopher, I won't detract because to come to some questions, but to my mind, the philosopher that you've mentioned there, most important for, certainly for my own work, is the Enlightenment context, but in modern times, that of Isaiah Berlin. My task today is less of an argument, but to sketch out the interface of two disciplines. And I want to contextualize that, first of all, in the setting of my own work. So I'm going to put the screen I think we can see this. So Esther, thank you very much for that introduction. And really I want to outline the interface of these two in the relation to the conference theme. And thank you very much for the invitation to present today. And it's nice to see so many friends and colleagues here. The interface between peace education and security studies. And I want to look at the origins, that's the beginnings of these two areas as disciplines, their ends or purposes. And I want to identify the fact that actually they're dealing with similar sorts of questions, existential questions, which I name provocatively perhaps apocalypse, but I do not think, particularly given our own present circumstance in the pandemic, stating these things. So Esther identified some of my own background. I just want to also credit some other of the universities where I can jointly hold professorships at Newcastle in Australia, Northwest University in South Africa, and the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies in Ireland, and also my work as Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham. Now my work is, as many of you will know, is rooted really across disciplines. the arts and humanities with education and the social sciences. And so what I've got to say today has helped me, I think, to identify this interface between peace education, peace and security studies. And I'll explain where this comes into things. But it's been important for me, this and beneficial, this interdisciplinary interface. So identify my own contributions, and I want to contextualize what I'm going to say today in this setting. These are 4 areas where I've made some modest contributions to knowledge. First of all, overlapping or cognate with what Hanan has said, the epistemological foundations of post-Enlightenment religious education. I've dealt specifically with the political and security aspects of religion in education, but I've also branched out improper to the discipline of security and intelligence studies, particularly where it hits a relation to universities, but also schools. And also, I think there's much to be said about the literary context here. And I'm going to draw on some aspects of the counterculture, particularly from the 1960s, which is relevant to our current debates. So those of you that are familiar with my work, particularly the book on the right, deals with many of the foundations, the post-Enlightenment foundations of religion in education. And I won't detail those now, many of you are familiar with them. But I want to highlight partly what Hanan said, but also to emphasize that these are conflictual. I mean, Hanan mentioned Kant and Hegel, but within an educational context and within religious education, there is severe conflict really between these notions, these secular humanistic notions and religious notions. And I've identified that in a number of papers. And I'll give some examples here, particularly on the secularization and the securitization of the sacred, and responding to debates between myself and Jackson, which you'll also be familiar with. So the religious and the secular. In research terms, of course, this is also about paradigm shift within religious education, and that's led also to some heated debates within the field. To the left there is that very important, most cited book on social sciences by Thomas Kuhn, and I found that book very useful. Some, of course, have contested my use of the paradigm in the context of religion and education to show the way it's shifting, but I do stand my ground there to show that religion in education has undergone some major shifts over the past decades. And many of those conflicts are political, between the relationship between religion and the state. My colleague Joseph Perdue and I, 2018, published a book, State Religious Education and the State of the Religious Life. Now, my work in security studies proper has identified the relationship between education, security, and intelligence studies. And in 2019, just a year ago this October, I published a 250,000-word book on the specific relationship between universities, security, and intelligence studies as disciplines. Now, where does this all come from? From a person working in religion and education? Well, it derives directly from my work on the political and security aspects of religion in education, particularly in terrorism and counterterrorism, which has accentuated the role of religion in education and the role of religion in society. I also, we can skip over this a bit, but in terms of my own literary background, I have a doctorate in English literature. I've looked at the literary components of this. Now, this literary component, literary theory, strongly correlates to post-colonial theory. So we see that many of the conflicts today, particularly in the Black Lives Matter, have their historical origins in the academic discipline is known as post-colonial theory. Now, I've edited, just being published now, the lead guest editor with our team on post-colonial theory and religious education. So getting onto this particular theme, we see that I want to argue that the respective origins of peace education, central focus of this conference, has a parallel origin in the beginnings of security studies. These are two academic disciplines. They're also important in activist terms, but they run in parallel. Now, I'm not drawing any conclusions today in this short presentation, but I do want to highlight to you all that there is a conjoining of their origins, and they're addressed to similar sorts of apocalyptic ends, a problem really in human life, which is fundamentally existential. Now, I'll briefly outline for you, for those that are not aware of what is called security studies, securitization theory in particular, and I'll just summarize this, often known as the Copenhagen School. And you'll notice on the right-hand set of notes, Barry Berzana, Allweaver, and others, their notion of securitization emerged from the Conflict and Peace, the Peace Research Institute in Copenhagen in the 1990s. And that's long after, decades after actually the beginning of peace education in other contexts. Their argument, in short, in the books that I've listed here, is simply put here. Their argument is that security as a notion, and if you look at the education policies in each of your states, in each of your nations, or across the European Union, or across the United States, they identified 5 major areas: military, political, societal, economic, and environmental. Pre 9/11, they added religion as one of the major components of securitization theory. Now, they don't like the move of securitization theory. They're more on the peace education side, but they have become a dominant theoretical perspective within the area of security studies and have directly impacted international relations. The next few slides I can actually skip through briefly, which gives you a wide range of the literature that's available in this field. But those 6 areas are where security has really, they regard it as an infiltration of society to all aspects of it. These are some of the major texts which identify this evolution of international security studies. Now, my friend Locke Johnson, a great man, American, a lot of involvement in American state agencies, and bringing many of them to account. This Oxford Handbook of National Security Intelligence is probably one of the most important books within this field. We get shorter guides, of course, which shows about the subject of international security never being out of the headlines, the subjects of war and peace, etc., being very, very prominent. I've looked at this work with my colleague in US military intelligence for the research implications in universities of this incursion of security into academic life. So we've got academic disciplines, but we've also got the notion of security making incursions into all of our lives, into all of our universities, into schools. Scott Parsons and I have identified and outlined the implications of this in a paper called Research Ethics in the Securitized University. I've also identified the implications of this in terms of ethics and epistemology in a paper published earlier this year called The Kill Chain. And I can explain the origins of that term if there are any questions on that. But these do relate to questions of life and death, as I shall explain. Now, so we see the origins of peace education back to the 1960s, Allweaver and the Copenhagen School emerging in the 1990s, but they're dealing with similar sorts of origins, and mostly within the United States, the civil rights movement, the peace movement there, in America in particular, in the United States in particular, but also internationally, and in the Cold War era. Now, the Cold War era dealt directly with an apocalyptic scenario. Only remember, please, everybody, remember the 1960s is only 2 decades. It's like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's the atomic age. It's as if the atom bombs, first atom bombs and nuclear atom bombs went off only in the year 2000. It's real history. But of course, the impetus of this is the deferred Cold War, the proxy Cold War, which was happening then in Vietnam. And for those of a certain generation amongst us, we will remember, and if we had time, I would indulge and play some of these clips. But there's important context here in peace education outside of the academic context, where we see a confluence. Remember, this is only 45, 55, 65, 60, the mid-60s. It's 2 decades only after. And it's the Vietnam War era. That also coincides two decades only from in America, from 1947, from the formation of the CIA. The countercultural movement is an important element, I think, to the origin and backdrop to what I've actually want to outline today in terms of the identification of this similar origins, similar ends, but different approaches to this one apocalyptic end or issue, the existential crisis. Now, when we look at the question of security, we can also think, we're a conference here on religions and peace. We can think really, oh, it's all post 9/11. And of course, post 9/11 is an important point in international security. It's when security budgets enhanced, when security and particularly counterterrorism permeated all disciplines. I've written extensively on this. But I highlight in this paper, Campus Conspiracies, from Kent State to Counterterrorism, how the origins of this notion about security and counterterror actually have their origins much earlier than 9/11, much earlier than 9/11, and they go back to the counterculture of the 1960s. For those of you who are not aware, I would recommend you just have a look at this song. It's the only paper where I've referenced a popular piece of music. Now, Kent State happened in May 1970, when unarmed students were fired upon by the National Guard. 4 students died. That event would be buried within history if Neil Young and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had not, in June 1970, written this song called Ohio, which opens 4 Dead in Ohio. And I detail the importance of that in the Nixon era in this paper, From Kent State to Counterterrorism, to show, as the Copenhagen School does, that security has imbued our universities, our schools, our societies over this period. The song from which this paper derives, again, for those of us of a certain generation, I was born in 1962, so I wasn't exactly tuned into this now, and I think I put much of this music behind me. But I think this 19-year-old young man, Barry Maguire, wrote this very, very powerful song in 1967, 1968. And it became an iconic song. And this is where I derive the title of this paper, because I do not think that the topics that we are talking about are merely matters of intellectual or academic abstraction. I mean, we are in the midst of a pandemic, but the nuclear context with which I've referenced is still really part of our political life. And the questions of security must continually return to these literally apocalyptic scenarios. And, again, we don't have time to play this song, but click on this link at some point for those of you that don't know the song and listen to this extraordinary lyrics. I'm not going to go through all of them. The Eastern world, it is exploding, refers to Vietnam, Cambodia, the outlying regions of Laos, Thailand, and so forth. And if we think this has nothing to do with academic life, we're wrong. Because academics were directly engaged covertly within the context of this conflict. If you read the book, classic work in anthropology, Anthropology Goes to War, the problem of the Vietnam War raised the issue of what I and my colleague from US military intelligence have identified of academic engagement in questions of security. And peace education, I think we need to be aware of what is our stance here in relation to the state. So this is a context. There are some very, very powerful lines in this. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. It's a popular song, but popular media, as today, as was then, directly influences popular opinion so much and societal attitudes. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting? And listen to this for those in the Middle East. And even the Jordan River has bodies floating. Things have not really dramatically changed today.
Liam, we've got 2 more minutes.
I've got my timer on. I've got 2:52, I believe, here.
We are on the same page.
Same page. The final verse of this song, think of all the hate there is in Red China. Take a look around to Selma, Alabama. You can look to Alabama and the southern states, but you can look all across the United States today with the Black Lives Matter movement. And this line I love, you may leave here, the atomic age is also the space age. You may leave here for 4 days in space, but when you return, it's the same old place. The problem, I argue, is always existential. Now, this has been identified long before all of the ages that I spoke about this out of fashion political thinker, but this famous science fiction writer in the 1920s wrote a famous series of work in the 1920s on history of the world. And he identified that human history is held between education and catastrophe. Education and catastrophe. That was in the 1920s. And we know what came forth there. Second World War, the Holocaust, etc. So I identify in my work as something about what I call the existential art of education and the tasks of university research. And I identify 4 particular domains, which you can skip over: the operational, epistemological, the ethical, and the existential. I detail this at some length, and I detail in these couple of slides the meaning of each of these. But the most important one for the purposes of this presentation, short presentation, is the existential domain. That this interface between, in my area of work, universities and the security and intelligence, is that how to address these existential threats. And so again, just to close, if we wanted to look at the specific, and I detail in more academic depth, the specific scholars in peace education, peace studies, and security and intelligence studies in this paper called the University Security Intelligence Nexus. But universities at the heart of all this, and to my mind, it is a major responsibility. Okay, so I think we can draw a close here, just with one sentence, this particular slide, just to say that the cultural and the religious, as well as political histories, are important in addressing these seemingly intractable conflicts. And to note, as we all do note in our own work, all of us, that religion has become an ever increasingly enhanced component of both peace, education, and security. So I think that's right on the dot here in timing.
Liam, thank you ever so much for your contribution. I do look forward to exploring those songs a bit further. Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't know them, you must. Yeah, they're all very wholesome.
It sounds exciting. Right, our third speaker joining us today is Eleonora Mura, and joining us from Switzerland. If we could stop sharing the screen, here we go. For Eleonora.
Okay.
Hi. Eleonora is joining us from Switzerland. She's in charge of the partnership development and resource mobilization for Arigato International. She's also a certified international trainer for their flagship program, Learning to Live Together, which aims to equip children and young people with skills to live in solidarity with people from all sorts of different backgrounds. And if you would like to add anything, Eleonora, please do, because there's a lot more in your bio. If I may, yes, and the title of your contribution today is Ethics Education for Children, a transformative pedagogy approach to build peace and resilience. Eleonora, if I may pass on to you. Would you like to have your screen shared? Okay, if you could share the screen again, please.
Yes, okay.
There you go.
I believe I'm sharing, right?
You are.
Yes.
Brilliant.
So good
Go
morning.
for it. You got 20 minutes.
Yes, good morning, everyone. As Esther said and nicely introduced me, I am Eleonora Mura and I work for an international NGO called Arigato International. So what I'm going to offer here today is a slightly different input, let's say, because I am on the practitioner side. So I've been mostly working with children and with teachers, putting peace education in practice. But I have listened carefully to the two presenters before me and I saw a lot of links. So somehow I'm also trying to put this conceptual framework in the ethics education approach and in the transformative pedagogy that we use when we do peace education. First of all, just briefly, this is the outline of the presentation. I will explain what Arigato International is. Then I will move into ethics education and how we view ethics education as a lens for peace education. I will move and I dig in really in the pedagogy approach. So I mean, this is the title of this session today, looking at pedagogical concepts for coexistence. So I will really focus on the pedagogical approach that we have been applying. And then I will present a practical application. So let me start with introducing Arigato International. I mean, some of you might know Arigato is the Japanese word for thank you. And Arigato was founded 30 years ago in Japan as a response and within Buddhist lay movements to do peace education and peace building work. So at the core of Arigato is very much working for the well-being of children, but very much also promoting child rights and peace education and bringing people of different walks of life together. Arigato has a few offices. I am representing today the Geneva office, but Arigato headquarters are in Tokyo, and we also work in New York and Nairobi. And we convene what is called the Global Network of Religions for Children. And this is a grassroots network that brings different grassroots movements of different religions together to work interfaith for the well-being of children. Esther briefly mentioned the ethics education and the program we have that is called Learning to Live Together. So I would really like to explain here that what we view as ethics is not much the study of the philosophy of ethics, but is rather really focusing on building positive relationships and on creating places for dialogue and for those positive relationships to happen across and among people of different religions and different cultures. So the ultimate goal of this program is really for children to live in solidarity, but as well as to be empowered to make ethical decisions. And there is very much the connection to nurture the spirituality as an element that is innate in children and that is also different from religion. So it's really the spiritual element. And one a component that is very much embedded in this approach is the agency of the child and the empowering of the child to make positive contributions to transform their communities. And if I may quote now Professor Anand Beck, is really the capacity to engage children, to go back to the square, if you want, and take in those public places to display their identity, display how identities can be different, but also appreciate these differences and work in solidarity for bigger goals also and for change in their communities. That's why we see ethics education really as a crucial element for education for peace in a multi-religious context. And we promote a new and dynamic way of thinking about ethics. So it's very much living the ethics and living the ethical demands of responding to our context and to the context and to the issues of plural societies. And in this sense, again, I would like to remind how important it is, for example, to talk about the sensitive issues. So not to isolate them, but to really discuss and talk them and dissect them in the classroom. So for us, when we talk about ethics education and in an interreligious and intercultural way, we're not talking about teaching about religions per se or about the different cultures per se, but we're really talking about an approach that looks at the positive relationships at the center of it and does it in an intercultural, interreligious ways that affirms diversity, but that most importantly affirms dialogue and communication within oneself. And here again, I would like to thank also Professor Anand for his emphasis on the cultivation of a robust sense of self, because with this program, what we want to do is not to cancel one's identity to make a global citizenship identity, but actually we want to cultivate this sense of self, this sense of identity, but as well as the importance of appreciating the other identities of others and connecting with others in an ongoing process that is both of individual learning about oneself and about how oneself can contribute to peace in their context, as well as collective learning. So the purpose of transformative pedagogy now, because so ethics education is the context in which operate, is the framework that we have designed, but then how do we apply it in our work for teachers is really using the transformative pedagogy approach. And this is in many cases an innovative learning process that empowers the learners and engages them as whole person in participatory and collaborative activities that contribute again to their sense of self, their sense of purpose, their sense of belonging, the interconnections and their sense of agency. So in order to reach this goal and purpose of the transformative pedagogy, it's very important, of course, to look at the role of teachers. And this is because what we promote with the transformative pedagogy approach is really an horizontal way of learning, where teachers and learners contribute to the learning, and when there is not this vertical transfer of information from the teacher or educator to the learner. And for us, looking again at this purpose of transformative pedagogy, it's also very important to build children's resilience. And again, if I might go back, looking at resilience as composed by these elements of sense of self, sense of purpose, and sense of belonging to a community. And most importantly, also sense of agency and of the role that as an individual child, I can have in contributing to building peace and building transformation in my community. This transformative pedagogy approach also looks not only at the skills and knowledges, but also at strengthening socio-emotional well-being. And this is also when we said that we bring the contextual issues and the sensitive issues in the classroom, because this also helps the socio-emotional well-being of the children when they can exchange about what is happening from them. It's an approach that aims to foster solidarity and interconnections. So there is really a lot of work that we do on the interconnections and on the connections among children across different socioeconomic lines, as well as cultural and religious lines. As we said, it's very much about supporting self-driven learning and very much about connecting education and peace education to the local context. Because in this approach, peace education cannot be limited to the classroom or to the school, but it really has to extend and to use the so-called whole school approach to really extend to the communities and be linked to what is happening around the students. The guiding principles of transformative pedagogy, as I said, include active participations of learners, include partnerships between the learner and the teachers, because as we said, we cannot imagine that the teacher can be transferring vertically information to the learner when it is about transformative pedagogy. Includes very much understanding the learner's experience, so putting the learner at the center of this learning and really being learner-centered in the approaches. Encouraging reflections and dialogue, which we think it's spaces that are very much missing in today's education. So there is not much spaces for reflections and dialogues where the learners can freely express themselves, can think critically about issues that are affecting their context. And therefore really helping learners generate their knowledge together. So when we look at this guiding principle, really what we promote with the transformative pedagogy in a way is a mind shift of how the learning is conceived and also of the role of the teachers and the educators, particularly in how they see the child, also particularly in how the learning takes place, as the learning really in the transformative pedagogy taking place in a more autonomous way, taking place in connections with other and working collaborative with other, and also really highlighting the learners' ownerships of these experiences and of peace education. When we talk also about transformative pedagogy, there are some key elements that we have put together, and I have already shared with you about the importance of really bringing the context into the learning and being sensitive to the context, the participatory and collaborative learning. But other elements that I really would like to highlight today are also supporting learners-led action. So connecting always the learning about peace with actions at the community level. Because in the peace education, there is very much this element of empowering learners to become agents of change in their community. And then there are three more key elements that I would like to highlight. So the first is the safe learning environment. And we feel that very much there is an underrating estimation of how a safe learning environment is not only about physical safety, but is also about feeling included in that space and feeling respected in that space, and feeling that I can contribute and I feel confident to express my ideas without being judged. So that's very much one key element of the transformative pedagogy, and it's one of the elements that we work a lot with teachers, so to really build a safe learning environment for dialogue and for reflection. I briefly also touched upon the whole school approach. And in practical meanings, what we mean with this, when we talk about connecting the school with the community, is that really we invite the school to go out. So for example, when it is about inter-religious learning, we invite teachers to maybe organize visits in different places of worships, or to invite people from different religious backgrounds to offer some lectures or presentations in the classroom. But this doesn't affect only the diversity in terms of religions, but also diversity in terms of culture. So maybe bring the different cultures together in the classroom, have cultural breakfasts. But this is also important for getting children engaged in the public life. So for example, also finding avenues for learners in the class to connect with their public representatives, with the mayor or with the councils, and express their needs, express their hopes, their frustrations, but really being in touch, because the school is not operating in isolation. And the final element that we have found out being a key is really the role modeling, because when we talk about ethics education, we talk about a model for doing values-based education. And as we always say, values can be nurtured, but they cannot be taught. So teachers have also to embody these values, and role modeling is really key. And this is where the journey for transformative pedagogy for peace really starts with teachers being self-aware of the biases that they bring in the classroom, and really doing a lot of work on their own in order to bring peace to the classroom, and in order to transmit and nurture values to the learners. So when we look at the important element of safe learning environment, and we said already some of these things, but today I would really like to focus on the inclusivity, because we're talking about peace education, and inclusivity is really a central element of this. So how we can encourage diversity. So we don't shy away from looking at diversity, but we encourage the sharing of diversity, but making everyone feeling welcomed and feeling valued. And I think I cannot emphasize enough the importance of feeling valued and appreciated when we talk about diversity and when we talk about peace education in a multi-religious context, because very much of what Professor Anand highlight as exclusion and isolation of views comes sometimes by those views being not valued and not appreciated when there is a sharing. So really, when we talk about safe learning environment, it's an environment that encourages the discussions, that encourages putting the issues on the table, encourages diversity, but it makes this diversity being appreciated. And it makes the learners being confident about their identity and about their diversity. As I said, it's about building horizontal relationship and trusting relationship that have to be respectful and genuine. So there is really a lot of work sometimes that we have to do, or that teachers have to do on themselves, in order to really build these trusting relationships with the students. And then there is one element that is often very sensitive because it goes and it speaks about the root causes of violence, about the structural causes of violence in the different society, looking at the power dynamics that are not only between minority and majority power groups, but it's also across ethical lines, cultural lines, religious lines, and gender. So these are whole sensitive topics, again, that might or may not relate to the context, depending on where we are. But these are topics that, in our opinion, need to be brought out and discussed with the students in a safe way, and that contribute to make that safe learning environment an open space for sharing. So I think, this was a short introduction, let's say, of the transformative pedagogy approach, but just to recap on some of the most fundamental elements, we take an holistic view of the child. We foster the interconnection between the learners and the capacity to work together with others. We bring the local context to education, and we really try to promote this approach where teachers are facilitators of the learning, but there is an horizontal relationship and a trusting relationship that is built between the teachers and the learners. And this connects very much also with education for sustainable development. As I said, the last part of my presentation was gonna look about a practical application. And in particular, I wanted to talk about a collaboration that Arigato started 4 years ago with the UNESCO International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa. So we have worked across different African countries, and we have worked mostly with teachers in the secondary school level. We have, well, first of all, we have designed this guide that you can see in the screen, Youth Empowerment for Peace and Resilience, Building for Prevention of Violent Extremism in Sahel and Surrounding Countries. This is the regional one about the Sahel, but we have worked also in the Horn of Africa and in Southern Africa. And I cannot really stop to emphasize how important is really the learners' empowerment, in this case, the youth empowerment, because we are talking also about adolescents and beyond, to build their resilience, and how resilience building for us, so connecting with identities and sense of belonging, is really at the core of peace education. And in this case, we start with the capacity of teachers. So we want to empower them on how education for peace and education for peace building is important. And some of the elements we offer are, for example, concentrating on the analysis of conflict. Because as we said, bringing the conflict, bringing the discussion about the conflict, understanding the conflict in the classroom is very important, and is a crucial element of peace education in our approach. In the guides, we also—
I've got 2 more minutes.
Yes.
2 more minutes.
In the guide, we also discussed the transformative pedagogy elements. We give practical tools also to assess this learning, because what we found out in our experience as practitioners is that very much sometimes peace education is not practiced in schools because there are no ways of assessing it. So we also give tools to assess the behavioral changes in the students, to assess decreasing level of violence, for example, in the classroom. And we give practical activities that can support experiential learning and that are practical as well as cost effective, because again, one of the issues that very much come when we talk about peace education, and even if we talk about study visits in other places of worship, teachers are always afraid of the costs. So we really present some cost effective activities that can be implemented. And these are the 4. When we look at the main goal of these guides is really building better relationships. As I said, for us, this is what ethics is really building positive relationships at local and national level, using education as the strongest preventing factor, and really using education and peace education in the larger sense to develop critical thinking skills, to promote dialogue, to raise awareness about nonviolent ways to respond, and also to encourage the celebration of diversity and the peaceful coexistence. And I would just like to end with this sentence from Paulo Freire. I mean, we have used many of his pedagogical approaches in developing our approach, and knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention. through the restless, impatient, continuing, awful inquire, human beings pursuing the world, with the world, and within each other. And this is really the basis for our approach. This is really the basis for the spaces, for creating dialogues that we want to empower teachers to think about. And this is also the basis for developing that critical thinker and the citizen of tomorrow. So thank you very much, Esther. Over to you.
Thank you, Eleonora, for your contribution and insight into Arigato. I'm intrigued by those activities, and I hope we'll get some time to get into some of those sort of the practical bits. I love that. Right, next, our fourth speaker is Sherto Gill. Dr. Gill is joining us from England, and she is working for the GHFP Research Institute, which is the Peace Foundation. And she's also a visiting fellow and associate lecturer at the University of Sussex. And at the moment, a director of a UNESCO research project, Healing the Wounds of Slavery. And today's contribution is called The Positive Conception of Peacefulness, Wellbeing and Education, a Post-COVID Vision for Peace Education. Sherto, would you like me to share the screen?
I'm okay, actually. Everybody has read a huge amount, and I'm going to talk and invite people to join me in a thinking exercise. And Esther, thank you very much for the introduction. Would you remind me too at the 2 minutes? I don't think I
shall
will
do
take
that.
that much. No. Yeah.
Okay.
Hanan has given us this introduction in terms of the importance of recognizing human diversity and difference. And then I'm very grateful that Liam has taken us to the root of peace education. And Eleonora then illustrated the possibility. So I'm going to stand back and invite everybody back to the origin of understanding three concepts. One is, what is peace? Two is, what is peace education? And thirdly, where is the religion's place in peace education? So I have three things to talk about. The first thing is, it's a positive conception of peace. The second, I look at peace education that's conceived from this positive conception. The third thing I'm going to talk about is place of religion in this. So the term peace. Well, I think everybody could reflect your own concepts of understanding of peace. The term peace applies to a wide range of situations, and those already touched upon. For instance, there's peace in the Liam setting is about its international relations, national security, countries, but there's also peace in neighborhood, in a family. There are also peace in processes, and someone just asked Hanan a question about the Israeli and the Palestinian peace process. There's also relations in peace in relationship amongst people, but also there's a peace from inner perspective. So how do we understand peace? At the one hand, we want to avoid a situation where peace is, well, there is a term actually, peace is a pieces, because there's so many different conceptions of peace. When when in that fragmentation, it is difficult to talk about peace, and it's difficult to move towards peace in the community or in the global processes. But at the same time, we don't want to have a one unifying concept of peace. There's losing all the pluralistic flavor of it. So how do we understand peace? Typically, peace is, definition of peace is constructed in a positive and negative. What is negative? Negative is peace is the absence of violence or absence of war. And but peace is peace and absence of conflict. And so that's the question that negative peace starts with. We don't tend to see peace as just absence of violence or war, because when you contrast peace with violence, we are following, Hanan would recognize the Hobbesian view, that that humans, that the human natural condition is de facto at war and is violent, competitive. And so, but is peace the absence of conflict? Well, if we look at conflict, conflict is in fact in part the ebbs and flows of life. Conflict is unavoidable. Therefore, we may see peace actually as a potential feature of all aspects of human life that involves conflict. But what makes it peaceful? And peaceful is a particular kind of quality that can calm the violent tendency in all the conflictual dimensions of human experience, from the kind of, we talk about international relations, our relationship with nature and so on, but also in terms of our own self-identification and our affiliations, our attachment, our sense of belonging, and so on. So hence, peace does not require eliminating of conflict. And instead, peace may invite what we all talk about, dialogue, and engage proactively those conflicts. So now, looking at peace from a positive perspective as a bridge, we can say peace actually is a human concept. Therefore, it is a value. And in fact, peace is a spiritual value, because peacefulness, it can be an inner state. Lots of faith traditions, religious teaching tend to see peace as that inner state. And we touched upon it. It's a special kind of tranquility whereby the person identifies with oneself as the essence of the I. The essential I is a spiritual I. In lots of traditions, they call it the soul. Hence the phrase, I am a soul. So this is when a person self-identifies as the spiritual I or the soul as a primary. And this is where we could unify the other self-identifications, such as identity based on ethnicity, language, class, gender, and so on and so forth. And so this spiritual I, when the spiritual I is the overarching self-identity over and above all other forms of self-identification, that's we found peace. So this is more of a bridge. Now we move from negative to positive peace. So positive peace, a peace is positive because it's also presence of something. Peace has positive attributes. So first we'll talk about the presence of that spiritual quality embedded in the I. And here we can link to what Hanan was already highlighted, that a positive peace assumes that persons are bearers of value. And this is when we recognize ourselves as bearers of intrinsic values and non-instrumental values. And this is a very important self-conscious awareness. And this constitutes a fundamental form of self-dignity, self-respect, and self-love. And it is thereby constitute in our well-being, and our well-being and its contents. What constitutes our well-being? And well-being includes our activities, our experience and processes, relationship, and our appreciation ourselves and our life as meaningful. So in a sense that positive peace involves our actively living out the spiritualness, or spiritual I, or humanness, and the good life. Now this means that it's a holistic understanding of peace. And I will just capture it once again. A holistic understanding of peace unifies the diverse layer and the multiple dimensions of peacefulness from an undivided vantage point. As we just seen, peace has integral meaning from one's inner state of being to the ways that one perceives and relates to oneself, with other persons, with other beings on the planet, for instance. And peace involves community relationship, international, transnational relations, but also involves the socio-economic and political system. And peace also can be a feature of institutional cultures and practice. And this conception of peace really highlights that although the psychology or the inner state of persons can be shaped by social structures, or the inner psychology of persons can be shaped by the social structures and political system that we find ourselves. Nevertheless, because it's the inner spiritual eye that we're cultivating, so humans can also make our own history, even if the conditions of such choice is not decided by us. In other words, that peace entails a conscious and enduring striving of humanity towards that peacefulness. It's almost like peace is a verb, although we don't have the verb peacing, but almost like peace is a verb, it's an active process. So this striving towards peacefulness, as already seen, is comprised at different levels. There's the individual level, individually, it consists that persons trying to actively strengthen our own capacity for that self-transcendence, going towards that spiritual eye. Relationally, it points at our goodwill towards other people through our friendship and sharing. And it consists of willingness to listen in the context of dialogue and collaborative ventures. But outwardly, it points towards an ethic of caring, including caring for the goodness in the world. And structurally, this striving means that we need to design institutions around this principle of spiritual value of peacefulness. So what does it mean? These the holistic conception of, or positive conception of peace, how does that take us to peace education? We often see peace education as resolving conflict through classroom practice. We talk about religious education, so that there is less tension between different religions and so on. But is that really the nature of peace education? So from this positive conception of peace and a holistic understanding of peace, we can see that peace education aims should be looking at those dimensions, reflectivity towards students' self-transcendence by cultivating the spiritual and the peaceful human qualities and nurturing our holistic well-being. So that's the inward leaf. And the second aim of education is towards developing, Eleonora talked about those openness and curiosity, critical elements, the willingness to encounter, to listen, to dialogue, to engage with others with difference, and to mutually recognize our shared humanness and our self-dignity embedded in the humanness. When equally, peace education should cultivate that attitude of caring for others, for things in the planet, for good causes, and for things that have meaning beyond ourselves, but equally take a proactive attitude towards that and take as having a sense of responsibility for advancing goodness in the world. So that is the aim of education itself. Eleonora talked about Paulo Freire's quote, being in the world and with the world. But Paulo Freire really talk about education essentially making each of us more fully human. So the second implication for peace education, I would say that our conception of peace can have implication for the features of education system. Is the system loving and caring? Is the system humanizing, enabling our human becoming? Is the system sensitive to students' holistic well-being? Is the system allowing us to live the value of the relational and the ethical? is a system allowing us to co-create activities, to take part in those collaborative ventures that constitute in peace process. And is a system a reflection of the spiritual dimension of our being? So these questions, so this understanding of peace really challenge the education system. And you can see these questions are not answered in positive way in our current education system. One feature is our education encourage competition through its system of testing. Our education praises individual success rather than the loving, caring, and collaborative features that are essential for peace building, for peacemaking. Our current education system deprives those at the margin, pushing them further into despair. I just know what that Eleonora talked about, the inclusivity and the loving. So maybe we need to reconceive the education system if we want it to contribute to peace. And the last implication of this, our conception of peace, is to do with the education process itself. Well, we feel education has consists of interlocking pillars. So the one is we need to have a concept of learning. We already talk about learning is actually seeking towards self-transcendence and human becoming. Well, the other pillar is pedagogy. Leonora talked about all kinds of pedagogy, transformative pedagogy. It's really at the center of it. The pedagogy is our process of engaging students from that spiritual core, but also from our own spiritual core. In that relating, the pedagogy become truly transformative. But think about another pillar, that is a curriculum. What is a curriculum? Is a curriculum just a set of things that we study from outside of ourselves? Or curriculum is a co-creating, because curriculum come from, it's the journey. And maybe curriculum is we co-creating a learning journey together, involving students' voice in bring the different elements together to make our collective shared journey a part of that we becoming. And the next pillar we already touched upon is, at the moment, it's called assessment. How about we call it evaluation? So that education is beyond the tyranny of testing, it's relationally conceived. And so that education evaluation is about valuing our learning process, valuing people's relationship within that learning process. And the last pillar is all this is enveloped in what Hanan talked about, the community. Community allows as transcending the interaction between roles. So when we come to an educational environment, it's not designated by roles. It's more than, because we are more than the role we occupy. So the enabling more personal, more caring, more loving relationship at all levels. In this sense, so peace education becomes education itself. Now, my third point is, where does religion and religious education come in? So often we heard, and this has already been touched upon, religious education is about learning about education, or learning of and learning about religion from outside of religion, or learning of religion, or learning from religion that's inside. So it's either there's an outside in view or inside out view of religious education. So in today's pluralistic societies that Hanan highlighted, religious education is interreligious education. Esther, I've got 2 minutes left, so I'll complete in 2 minutes, no problem. So in a sense that religious education can only be interreligious education. That pedagogy for difference means all religious education has to be interreligious education. Now, so religious education within our conception of peace and within our connection conception of peace education, that means interreligious education should help a young person to recognize there's a fundamental spiritual core shared by all religions, all faiths, that is the transcendent. And that means interreligious education should allow all the children and young person who were born in a particular religious environment to learn to better appreciate and understand, interpret the teaching of their own religion. Again, that transcendent. And this celebrated the transcendent nature of spiritual dimension of all religion can serve to unite rather than divide, providing ground for acceptance of difference. And so interreligious education in this way, as a part of peace education, would open up the opportunity for children and young people to develop their self-concept and consider the spiritual dimension as part of the unfolding self. Now, just to conclude, I bring this back into a quick summary. So peace has positive, I started with saying peace has positive attributes. And then I also said that peace is a human concept, therefore it's a spiritual value. And when this primary self-identity as the spiritual I, then that's when the peacefulness can come, the antagonist tendency to the conflictual dimension of human being. So peace education, that's conceived, is not a study of peace from outside of peace itself, or prevention of violence or resolution of conflict. Or it's not even just about learning about justice and citizenship, global issues and so forth, although these are important. Peace education is best achieved through this humanizing education we just talked about. It is itself comprised in nurturing the quality that can make our well-being more fully complete. Religion offers, religious education would pledge on what religion offers best, that is community, loving and caring practices, stressing our human dignity and encouraging the ethical dimensions of being. And so to conclude that peace is education as a humanization.
Sherto, thank you very much. And I think other participants may agree. As you were unpicking the concept of peace, I felt increasingly more calm and peaceful. Your delivery is very nurturing and calming. Thank you. As we're now heading into sort of unpicking some of the topics further and taking some questions, I was wondering whether our speakers could open up their pictures so we could see you, Liam, Hanan, and Eleonora. That would be nice. We can see who's waiting with us.
My picture says that you've stopped my picture. I can't open it.
Oh, how could I have possibly done that? No. Could we get... There we are. Hanan, you're back. Thank you to all four of you. And I encouraged questions to be posted into the chat box. And I believe we've already got one for you, Hanan, which you kindly offered to further unpick. So, Hanan, the first question directed at you is, how do you anchor your thought in the context of the Palestinian and Israeli context?
Yeah, so this is a very complicated question. I don't think that I can fully address it in detail in the short time of answering the question. I gave in the chat there some references where I've dealt with it in much greater detail. In part because there are a huge number of misconceptions about the nature of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, including the fact that somehow there is a conception that somehow if we can resolve conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians, somehow we can make peace in the Middle East. Now, what the recent political developments, the so-called Abraham Accords and so on, are suggesting that the Palestinian conflict with Israel may not be the core conflict, and that its roots, given the Palestinian response to those agreements, the roots of the conflict may be different than sometimes are perceived in the international liberal community. And that could cause a big debate here that probably would take us far afield from the discussions of peace. But the one thing that I would say, and that I spoke about, or wrote about, both in the article and the chapter that to which I've referred, is that the idea of pedagogy of difference entails the idea of initiation into a particular narrative, but a narrative that is prepared to engage in dialogue with others. That is to say, the narrative into which pedagogy of the sacred would initiate is in what I call an intelligent spirituality, intelligent in the sense used by the term Nil Noddings, that intelligent believers and unbelievers oftentimes have much more in common with one another than they have in common with unintelligent believers and unbelievers. So that is to say, what we have in common is a willingness to discuss or dialogue, to engage the other in genuine and embracing dialogue. And so the initiation into a particular identity, whether that's a secular Israeli Jewish identity, or whether that's an Orthodox religious Israeli Jewish identity, or some other kind of Israeli Jewish identity, or whether that's a Palestinian identity as a citizen of Israel, or in some other kind of Palestinian identity, that's the first step. But part of that involves an initiation to an identity that's prepared to engage others in dialogue. The second step, the pedagogy of difference, involves trying to understand one's situation from the other's point of view. Something that we don't do in Israeli education hardly at all. There is the term called the Nakba, or the catastrophe of the creation of the state of Israel, which many Israelis find a difficult or even offensive term, but it is essential in part to the Palestinian identity. To try and understand that idea for Israeli youngsters, to understand that idea from a Palestinian perspective, but also for Palestinian youngsters to understand why those of us who are Jewish and consider ourselves Israeli celebrate the creation of the state of Israel. Do not consider it to be a catastrophe. To consider it to be the overcoming of a fundamental historical injustice that's been perpetrated against the Jewish people for close to 2,000 years. And that's why the discussion here is a complex one, and I deal with this in the chapter called Mature Zionism, because the discourse about Zionism in Israel in critical social theory, the critical social theory that I referred to in my paper, often is a discourse that relates to Zionism, I call it, from the outside, from the perspective, in particular from the perspective of the injustice that's experienced by Palestinians, but doesn't relate to Zionism from the inside perspective. That is to say, from the perspective of Jewish history, which sees Zionism as the culmination of forces that began already in the Bible during the period of the prophets. The term Zion is the reference to Zion is a reference that's first made by Ezekiel and Isaiah, in reference to the exile from Jerusalem to Babylonia. So the role of Zionism and the way in which it plays itself out in Jewish identity is crucial. Zionism is, among many other things, it is a revolution in Jewish identity. It is Jews taking responsibility for their own history, culture, and future, something that was abrogated over many years. At least those of us that see ourselves as Zionists think that to be the case. So part of what needs to happen is not only for Jews to look at the Nakba from the perspective of what it means to be a Palestinian, Israeli Jews in particular, because Jews outside of Israel may have an easier time with this, but also it requires of Palestinians to try and get inside what it means to be a Zionist, what Zionism means to Jewish history, not in relation to them, not in relation to what it may have addressed to them, but in relation to the trajectory of Jewish history itself. This is exactly the sort of dialogue that I argue for, that has a promise for peaceful coexistence, which entails coming from a robust sense of who I am, that's secure, that's not threatened by critique, and that doesn't seek to perpetrate itself on others, and a genuine willingness to try and understand the other whose views may be different than mine, may even be contradictory to mine, may challenge me in some profound and deep and important way, and yet require me somehow to set myself aside and try and understand them as well. I could go on at length about this, But in general, I actually, the idea of pedagogy of difference arose among many contexts, one of which was in a religious dialogue. But the second was in my own struggle, and I deal with this in the introduction to my book, Reimagining Liberal Education, my own struggle to deal with the situation of the relation between Israelis and Palestinians when I moved to Israel 21 years ago. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Hanan. Thank you, Hanan. I have got a question for Liam now. Liam, what is the relationship between peace education and security policy? How can this question be resolved without political positioning, as this debate is fairly topical in Europe at the moment? So, first question, what is the relationship between peace education and security policy?
Well, it's complex. I mean, you know, the peace education, peace studies originates, and again, I go back to into the Cold War context. I can answer this quite briefly. That it goes back to the Cold War context and the what was known in those times as the atomic age, campaign for nuclear disarmament, and so forth. And it was about rejection of security apparatus. It was about rejection of militarization, increased militarization. If we take that forward to the times of the Copenhagen School, 1990s, what is observable, and they're observing trends, you know, starting from the early 1990s that have then emerged subsequent to that, about the increased securitization within societies across every single society on earth, where notions of the security apparatus within states, including both overt and covert, that's the security and intelligence agencies, and that will directly apply, particularly in, they've had a very important role to play, if we go back to Hanan's context in Israel. The secure Mossad and related agencies have had an incredibly important role to play in support of the state. If we look to Hannah Arendt's work in, you know, famously her Origins of Totalitarianism, which nobody has mentioned today. I mean, the greatest threats to peace over the 20th century is the rise of Nazism in the 1930s and the subsequent aftermath of that. But I mean, if you look at Hannah Arendt's work on Eichmann in Jerusalem, the banality of evil, Eichmann on trial in the early 60s, you know, the security and intelligence agencies. Now, the relationship to peace education, I think they've been completely, I mean, I might as well be trenchant about this. They've been essentially not in dialogue with security apparatus of the state and the political issues, yes, but a rejection of the security apparatus. And I think this is one of the problems. The peace education, actually, to my mind, and often for good reasons, arises as a direct confrontation and a conflict with the security apparatus, beginning with the civil rights, but also in the campaigns for nuclear disarmament and so forth. But Esther, you mentioned about political positioning. Yes, of course. All of this requires a political positioning. The ideals of peace need to actually engage with these political questions. And, you know, we talk about religious stances and understanding different religious groups, but there is also in each of those religious groups not essentially a uniformity. They have different. Look at the United States. There's vast differences in alliances in religious groups to the two parties coming up with the American election next year. So this political dimension, the political is in a sense, for most of us, the democratic middle ground between the campaigns for peace, which is allowed within democratic societies, security apparatus, which is also allowed within democratic societies. And it's about understanding that. But we cannot ignore from peace education the security apparatus. And all I've tried to do is highlight the undercurrents of how our societies are actually maintained. Now, people can say the security apparatus, just one sentence and I'll close. People can say the security apparatus is oppressive, and in many states it can be regarded as that, acts of violence and so forth. We see that in many contexts. Look at Nigeria this week. It's not an easy matter. However, in relation to the maintenance of peace, the other two speakers, Certo and Eleanor, mentioned about the beyond international relations, the family, the communities. Well, peace in those contexts can only be maintained by the security apparatus in many cases. The security agencies in our states are often play an important role in the maintenance of the possibilities of peace within our communities. When it collapses, we can't have peace anywhere. If the international arena is not stable, if our states are not stable, we cannot have peace in our communities. So when I say about international relations, it has implications right down to the core. If you look at the question of next door to you, Hanan, and the others in Israel and the Middle East, look at Syria, look at the rise of IS. So, you know, we come then into the question of terrorism and counterterrorism, which is a very, very real threat. And of course, it's entirely problematic. How much then do schools and universities contribute to these debates? I mean, in England, we've got the Counterterrorism Security Act. Universities, schools are drawn directly into this, these security agendas, precisely as, you know, back 3 decades ago, the Copenhagen School had highlighted. So in political positioning, it's different. It's difficult, but it's always part of there are always sides. It's always part of the debate. So all I was trying to do is simply, just final word, is just simply highlight the security dimension of it. And one of the problematics of the security dimension, it's often covert. It's often underneath the surface of the societies in each of our states. There are secret intelligence agencies which work for the maintenance of the safety and security and ultimately peace of our societies. People have got lots of different views about that. So I was just throwing it in as an element, and look to my Routledge International Handbook on University Security and Intelligence Studies, and you'll see some of the complexities of that within individual states and in international relations.
Liam, thank you. Thank you for unpicking that. I have one participant made a suggestion, look at a piece of study in relation to our topic on Palestinian-Israeli context. We have one question for Certo, and I believe you have replied to this one, but would you like to sort of quickly go into it? The question is, peace education means humanization, as you said. However, people often understand the word human to be able to defend one's own rights, to rebel, to demonstrate. How can we change this attitude, Certo?
Well, yes, I sort of briefly touched upon. I think when we talk about human, well, let me just first start from what's happening in this room. And I think that we precisely talk about peace from 2 perspectives, the positive and negative. And when Liam talk about the Cold War and so on, the origin of peace education is definitely seeing peace as a negative conception. It's the absence of war and violence. And therefore, peace education is about how we can engage our own processes so that we can avoid becoming those enter into that antagonistic relationship. And as our colleague just posed the question, but on the other hand, we could see peace as a positive concept, or we see peace as a positive concept. Then we immediately come towards the transcendent nature of humans being. And that is really the common core, I said, amongst all the religious traditions and faith traditions. If we can see human being from that perspective, if we go into our own self and realize that there is inner being of us, and that is over and above the color of our skin, the background we're from, and the kind of the national border that we belong to. When that happens, then we can connect to others from that sense of we-ness. So it's not just I, myself, my nation, my tribe, my suffering, my pain, my conflict with my neighbor. But if you could see that, that's the greater sense of we. Well, in fact, there is a program in the 90s. It's religious education program is the common word. What is the common word? So here, I think the common word is love. If we could draw on that, we can, because that's where the real hope lies. If we go back to the Hobbesian view of human nature, and that we are all competitive, selfish, and we just only want to guard our own, whatever that is our own, then there's no hope for humanity. So in some ways, when we conceive something from a normative perspective, we have to see why it is so valuable to do it in this way, to perceive it in this way. If we understand peace from that positive perspective, actually we can begin to engage peacefulness, engage our education from that core. If that is happening, COVID has illustrated that we are interconnected whole, whether being human beings or with nature. So that's what holds promise.
Thank you, Chateau.
I would have a question to Eleonora Mura. I was very much impressed by her presentation with the concept and the work. And my question is, I have reported yesterday about the 10th World Assembly of Religions for Peace. And in the follow-up of the conference, they've developed a strategic plan 2020 until 2025. And we will have 5 commissions, standing commissions working, and one is strengthening interreligious education. And I think we will go and show ways of interreligious learning in different contexts. And I would just ask if we would like to participate in this process.
Yes, Johannes, most gratefully, we would like to be one of the good practices, if you want, for interreligious education. And I think, Esther, if you allow me, I will also build on this to reply to one of the questions that I saw in the chat. And what I meant when I said that we don't want to teach, in brackets, a global citizenship identity, it's not exactly that. I mean, it has to be taken into context. But what I wanted to highlight is that we start from the self and from who we are, and we don't shed away from diversity, we don't shed away from our religious identities in order to really build interconnections with one another. And we can really very much see that when we start to the self, to who we are, we can find a lot of interconnections with the others. So that's our first step in the program. So really peace starts with yourself, starts with looking at who you are, at your origins, as well as the connections with others. And then I definitely agree with you that in religion, and also building on what Sherto said, so in religion, there are many universal concepts as well that are really, and that can be used to build peace and to build in the peaceful dimension of religion. For example, even if we think of how the nature of children itself is conceived in religion, the sacredness of the children, the dignity of the children, we can use this very much also for making an argument to child-centered and learner-centered learning. So really starting from that dignity and empowering that child, giving that learner agency to build peace and to build peace with the others. So it's very much a building on the global citizenship concepts, but it is not under that banner. It is very much under the banner of peace education. It is very much under the banner of starting from self-awareness and then going out and making connections with the others and appreciating diversity. But it's really building on what, again, Professor Anand said, on really not shedding away from feeling secure with who we are, so to really be having a robust sense of oneself, and then being open to explore and to accept, understand and value the other narratives out there. And that in this way, also how do we move beyond tolerance and to really acceptance and valuing of others' points of view and of others' backgrounds. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you, Eleonora. I don't have any more questions in the chat, but I have a question myself, Eleonora, to you. The educational psychologist in me is always intrigued by practical applications in the classroom. When you mentioned activities, could you share just one activity with us, how you translate that into the classroom that you guys do?
Yes, I mean, I think, many activities, for example, are really focusing on creating moments from dialogue and reflections. And also many activities are focusing on the capacity of listening to the other. Because very much, I think we are overwhelmed with many narratives, we are overwhelmed with information out there, but we're not really listening to the other. So in the program, there are many activities that go with listening. For example, there is one activity where there is one person describing something and the other are trying to draw that thing that is being described, but without building on their prejudice of what this thing is, because also very often we are hearing, but we're not listening, and we are still continuing on our perception of what is being said. But then there are also many activities that build really on this sense of empathy, of empathy. And this really builds on this humanizing of education that Sherto was talking about. And now we nurture our own quality that make us complete, but we also are ready to empathize with the other and to be in their own shoes. So there are some activities like, for example, drawing the silhouette of the others, or really trying to being in situations of dangers, maybe, I mean, playing activities like that in the classroom that could potentially put us in situation of dangers, or also role plays. And so that we can think, how would we feel and behave if we were in the place of the others? And I think that's also in the pedagogy of the sacred that Professor Anand was saying, in this being prepared to understand by adopting the other's point of view. And so we try to do this in a very practical sense, sometimes with case studies or with situational that are not related to the context, but so that help the learners to go out, let's say, also of their inhibition, of their stereotypes, and to be in a different situation that is seemingly unrelated to the context, but it actually relates at the level of the skills or of the empathies or of the values that we are trying to nurture.
Thank you, Eleonora. That's some nice ideas. Thank you. All right, we have come to an end. We are slightly over, but I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all our speakers and the participants, the questions, and I mean, we're walking away with a lot more new ideas and inspirations. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Yes,
thank you for hosting, Esther, and nice to see somebody here. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you to colleagues.
Bye-bye, Liam.
Really, the papers complemented each other beautifully. Brilliant.
Thank you. It's good to see you all.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.